Can you prove Jesus? Well, in theory, absolutely. Anything real has evidence to back it up. Granted, something without evidence isn't automatically unreal, but we don't believe things because they can't be proven false, but because they've actually been proven to be true. So let's keep that in mind as we go through this. We're going to get back to Andy Bannister because apparently Andy thinks that he can prove Jesus was real. Now, I wouldn't be getting your hopes up because, he's going to do absolutely nothing of the sort, but we can at least use him as an object lesson to see the kind of underhanded wishful thinking that the religious engage in and try to convince people that their imaginary friends are real. So, without further ado, let's get started.
Have you ever wondered if Jesus actually existed?
Sure. Have you? Because that's the thing. Most people, especially most Christians, they've never really asked that question. Jesus is just a foregone conclusion based on their faith alone. In fact, as we get into this, I figure I'm going to have to ask this because it almost always comes up. But what do you mean by Jesus? Define your terms. Which Jesus are you talking about? Some guy that might have lived 2,000 years ago in and around Jerusalem, or the magical man god described in the Bible who did miracles and came back from the dead? You can't have both. Pick one. You might be able to make a case for the former, but the latter is complete nonsense. But let's see where Andy goes with this, and we'll come back to it then.
Sounds a strange question, and in fact, if you grabbed any history professor at any credentialed university anywhere in the world, they would look at you like you're mad because it's taken as a given that of course he did. The evidence is so overwhelming.
Except it's not. There isn't any actual evidence for it. The only reason that most people would respond that way is because Christianity as a cultural construct has had such a strong influence over Western culture for thousands of years. But that doesn't actually make it true. This is where I figure that Andy is going to get into trouble because he, like most people, are just asserting things that they have not personally checked out. They don't understand the question that they're asking. Well, of course Jesus was real. Really? Back that up with evidence. Note, I said evidence, not confirmation bias. Don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what you can prove. And I don't suspect this is going to go well.
But you can find people lurking in the darker corners of the internet who have, advanced the idea that Jesus never existed. And so I meet people who've read that or heard that and are therefore puzzled.
And here, if you notice, Andy tries to poison the well. Is anyone really surprised? Because if you go solely by the evidence that we actually have at hand, the case for Jesus is not strong at all. He wants it to be, but without faith and people agreeing for the sake of argument, there's really nothing there to examine. And I'm sure we'll get into that in a second. I just wanted to point out that he's writing checks that his theology can't cash. Anyway, onward.
So what can we say about the question of Jesus and history? Well, there are so many things I could say, and we've covered this elsewhere on the Solas website over the years. But let me come into the question in this video through the angle of archaeology.
Sure. It won't help because archaeology can never establish the existence of an actual human being. I mean, unless you're digging up bones, which, according to the religious, Jesus rose from the dead and therefore he left behind no physical traces. All Christians have are claims about Jesus, but no actual evidence for Jesus himself. And that's an important distinction to make. However, let's let him go for it and we'll evaluate what he says. Again, I don't think this is going to go as well for him as he thinks.
Not many people are necessarily aware that biblical archaeology is actually a very live discipline with conferences and academic articles and university courses and so on and so forth. Simply being because when you go and dig in the sands of the Middle East, often what comes out of those archaeological digs is evidence and information that corroborates or casts light on the Bible.
And you've immediately got issues. See, here's the thing. Biblical archaeology is done by people who are already convinced by faith that whatever it says in the Bible is true. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, you got highly religious people who just went out into the desert with a shovel in one hand and a Bible in the other. And whenever they found something, immediately they just looked in the Bible to figure out what it was. Unfortunately, a lot of those identifications were simply false. They were completely overturned by later study. You can't just assume that the Bible is true. Your faith doesn't mean anything. A site is whatever that site happens to be, biblical or not. And even if the Bible does mention said site, that doesn't mean that whatever your big book of multiple choice says about that site ever actually happened there. It doesn't mean that the people were real. It doesn't mean that anything magical happened there. All of that needs to be supported independently. And of course, this is where Spider-Man makes an appearance. Just because we know that New York City exists, that doesn't mean that Spider-Man is real. Spider-Man lives in New York City. 50 plus years of comic books say so. In fact, lots of superheroes live in New York City. The Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the Defenders, the New Warriors, and the Midnight Suns. All of those are groups that call New York City home. Spider-Man, Daredevil, Luke Cage, Punisher, Moon Knight, Doctor Strange. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. If City X existed, therefore the Bible is true, well, then the existence of New York means that all of these superheroes are real. There are no double standards. Knock it off.
Sure, you're not going to go dig a trench in ancient Israel, in what was ancient Israel, and prove the Bible, but you can corroborate the Bible. And corroboration is often what archaeology offers us.
You can prove that whoever wrote the Bible, and for a lot of it we have no clue, but you can prove that they provided some real details. Fine, whatever. Here's a problem though. Famous horror writer Dean Koontz, he once wrote a book that featured the very street that I grew up on. It's real, you can prove it. Stephen King sets lots of his books in Maine. It's a real place. Are we supposed to believe that evil clown spirits or whatever really exist? I mean, King himself says that Derry is based on Bangor, Maine, where he lives. It's real. That doesn't prove anything. We can go on and on and on and on about this. Just because a real place is mentioned in a book of fiction, that doesn't make the fiction real. I know that the religious want to believe the Bible is correct, but that requires evidence, and sadly they don't have any. So, until you find some, you're just wrong. Moving on.
In fact, I was talking to a friend who is an archaeologist just the other day who shared with me an interesting piece of information I'd actually never heard before. He said to me, it's interesting. He said, in biblical archaeology right now, it's exciting times because we now know of the names of, we have 53 names of figures from the Old Testament who we now have corroborated through inscriptions, coins, other things that have come out of the sands of the Middle East.
Big deal. See, what he's trying to do here is assert that just because we can validate some things, some very mundane things in the Bible, that suddenly that makes all things in the Bible real. And that's not how this works. Just because we can prove that, for example, Nebuchadnezzar II was real, mentioned in Ezekiel 26, Deuteronomy 1, 2 Kings 24, etc., that doesn't mean that Adam and Eve were real. Just because we can prove that Pontius Pilate was a real person, that doesn't mean that Jesus was real. Inserting real people into fictional stories doesn't make it any more reliable than if you just made it all up yourself. Every single thing needs its own support, and they simply don't have it.
And he looked at me and said, do you know, just incidentally, how many people here in Britain from before the Roman conquests in the first century, how many people do we know of in the same way through archaeology who we actually have their names? I went, I don't know, 15, 20? He went, 0. 0. We know of none. There is nothing like it. Whereas in the ancient world, we have huge amounts.
So what? It doesn't matter. Keep in mind, the people that he's talking about from the Bible were kings and other influential people. Also, a lot of them were just mentioned in correspondence, some of it pretty tenuously at best, and we really have no way of knowing if it was a circulating story or a real person. Again, real people don't prove real events. He is, however, trying to compare that to what are essentially peasants. People who you wouldn't expect to leave anything behind but their bones. They didn't matter. Also keep in mind that most of the individuals in the Old Testament, they weren't recorded doing anything that spectacular. They were just kind of there. The Old Testament lists a lot of people who were just there. They did nothing at all of consequence, especially when it came to the supernatural claims of the Bible. So just existing doesn't really mean anything, does it?
Now, when it comes to the Gospels, we have even more. Things get very interesting the way that archaeology has helped, again, just corroborate the narratives. So take, for example, the third Gospel writer, Luke. Luke wrote a Gospel, and he also wrote the book of Acts, a sort of two-part book looking at the life of Jesus and and what happened with the early church. And there's a very famous example where in Acts 18:12, Luke uses the term proconsul to describe a man called Gallio. And until recently, there was no other occurrence of the word proconsul anywhere in Greek literature as a title for a civic ruler. And so skeptics began to say, well, Luke's got it wrong. He's made this term up, he's making the story up, or he's got it completely wrong. We can't trust him.
Except that's not at all true. The earliest appearance of the word proconsul, or one who acts on behalf of a council, started around 135 BCE. Ancient historians described Quintus Publius Philo, who was the very first proconsul, in 326 BCE, just not in the shortened form. So Andy is just wrong. It might have been the first occurrence of it in the Bible, but it was certainly not a term that would have been unknown to the author of Luke, whoever the heck that might have been. I'm not sure where else he can go with on this one, considering just how mistaken he is.
Well, in 1905, a team of French archaeologists were digging in a town called Delphi in Greece, and lo and behold, a stone tablet emerged from the from the trench they were digging. And this tablet was in pieces, but as they assembled it together, they discovered something interesting. Not merely did this tablet, which dates to AD 51, not merely did it mention the same title, a proconsul, it used it for the same person, Gallio, was mentioned. Luke had the right title, the right person, the right place, the right date. And that inscription, which you can now go and see in a museum, is known as the Gallio inscription.
So what? Now, I know I'm saying that a lot, but he's halfway through his video, and he hasn't gotten anywhere remotely close to providing any evidence for Jesus. That is what he's supposed to be doing here, right? Of course, he's just pulling a gish gallop, throwing a bunch of irrelevant crap at the wall, so that when he gets to his entirely unjustified claim at the end, he's just hoping that you'll fall for it without asking too many uncomfortable questions. He's just waving his hand going, well, look at all this stuff over here. Granted, it all falls apart the moment that you look at it, but all of the stuff over there, even if it was valid, it doesn't have anything at all to do with the existence of Jesus. That requires its own specific corroboratory evidence. Stop wasting our time, Andy. Get to the good stuff.
Something similar happened with the fourth Gospel, John's Gospel, where in John chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, John talks about a healing that Jesus did at the pool of Bethesda, which he tells us was near the sheep gate in Jerusalem. And for a long time, this puzzled scholars because there'd been lots of archaeological digs done in Jerusalem. That part of the city had been dug, no such pool had been discovered. And also, John added a particular detail that seemed really odd. He said this pool was surrounded by 5 covered colonnades, rows of arches and pillars.
It doesn't matter. The existence of a thing doesn't mean a particular event happened near that thing. This is just a distraction. When he gets to Jesus, which hopefully he'll do soon, he's going to need direct, demonstrable, verifiable evidence for Jesus. And I think we all know that he's not going to have any. That's why he's going on with this stupid preamble. If he had anything of substance, he wouldn't bother. He just trotted out. So I'm going to ask again. Please, can you get on to your supposed evidence? You're not doing yourself any favors by just putting it off.
And that seemed a very strange way to build a pool. Why would you build a hexagonal pool? Well, again, early part of the 20th century, a new piece of archaeology was done and some new diggings were done in Jerusalem in that part of the city. And lo and behold, out of the rubble emerged the shape, the outline of this very mysterious, very strange pool. And it was a rectangle, 4 sides, with a 5th colonnade across the middle. In other words, 5 colonnades. Right pool, right features, right place, just as John had discovered. Now, don't get me wrong. The archaeology can't prove that everything the Bible tells us about Jesus is true, but it gives the Bible the ring of history. The Bible is not telling fairy stories about some time in the past separated from reality. The Bible grounds the stories of Jesus. The other stories of the Bible, they're grounded in times and places and names and dates that archaeology time and time again can corroborate or verify.
And here we can just go right back to Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man number 36, written in 2001 by J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr., is all about Spider-Man and other Marvel superheroes reacting to and helping with the 9/11 terrorist attack. In it, we can see, depicted anyhow, actual scenes from the real event. You can find those exact same images, or very close, in photographs and videos of the time. That does not mean that Spider-Man and Captain America and the Avengers were there. You need that independent corroboration, and sadly, the religious just don't have it. What Andy is really doing here, and of course he's not remotely alone, is trying to distract you. Well, look over there, while he slips his claims in about Jesus and hopes that you don't notice. And you might say, well, just because they don't have the evidence, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. That is true. It just means that they haven't proven their case. See, I didn't make a video saying, here's proof that Jesus isn't real. No, I'm just responding to Andy, who is claiming to be able to show that Jesus did exist. I'm not saying that there is no Jesus. I'm just saying, claim not proven. Please try to do better. You have to if you hope to get anywhere worthwhile.
But one last thought. Even if you ignored all of those tons of archaeology and threw it aside, I'm still doubting Jesus. If you throw Jesus away, the problem is you create a much bigger problem for yourself.
Oh, this ought to be good. I'm trying to figure out just how dumb this could be, and as you know, I've got no idea what he's going to say next, so I guess we're going to have to see. Regardless, he hasn't actually said anything about Jesus yet. He's just been arguing from assertion and wild hand-wavium. Not once has he actually addressed Jesus. It's like saying, well, they mention London in the Harry Potter books, therefore Hogwarts is real. That is not how this works, though. But this is exactly what the religious do. And so we're going to take a step back for a second. You notice that the basic Christian model is, well, I don't get it, therefore God. All of the philosophical arguments say the same basic thing. Here's this stuff I don't get, plug Jesus or God or whatever in at the end. But they've never actually shown the steps between here's this thing and here's this God. And there's a lot of steps in there you've got to fill in. You can't just jump from the beginning to the end. But that's all that they do, because that's all that they want, because that's the conclusion that they want to reach. But that's not how this works, though. So let's see how he wraps this up, having done absolutely nothing of any significance so far. Place your bets now. Is it going to be convincing, or is this just going to be typical Andy Bannister stupidity? I guess we'll have to find out.
Because now you have a Jesus-shaped hole in history, and you struggle to explain the early church.
No, I don't. The fact that people believed a thing, that doesn't make that thing real. Because here, Andy is just shooting himself in the foot. You can take any religious claim ever and say, well, if you reject that that claim is true, then you're leaving a whatever shaped hole that you like in history. Except you're not. The fact that people believe things and act on those beliefs, that doesn't mean anything, any more than the fact that L. Ron Hubbard thought that he could get rich by inventing a religion makes Xenu real. If that's where you're going with this, Andy, you're even worse off than I thought.
You know, some religions get going because becoming a member of that religion, like early Islam, gets you power and influence and military connections. But to be a Christian in the first generation was usually a fast track ticket to arrest, torture, execution, and so on. Why did the first Christians believe? Why did the church begin if those eyewitness accounts or purported eyewitness accounts in the Gospels aren't actually true? Because Christianity began within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of Jesus.
Well, that's the story. Now back it up. Granted, he can't, and we all know it. This is just an article of faith, nothing more. We already know that Jesus, if there ever was a Jesus, he was just another apocalyptic preacher, one of many that were wandering around Palestine at the time. In fact, it's entirely possible that his story was just based on one or maybe several of those self-proclaimed messiahs. We just don't know. There were no demonstrable eyewitnesses to anything that we can verify. The Gospels were written anonymously by mostly demonstrable non-eyewitnesses. Paul never saw anything of consequence, and he even admits it. Where are these verifiable eyewitness accounts of Jesus? Funny, I seem to have missed those. Wonder why.
Much easier to face up to the fact the Gospels have the ring of history. They're corroborated by archaeology, and all I'm inviting you to do is read them. And as you read them, wonder to yourself, who do they describe? Who is Jesus sound like he is? What are the claims he's making? And do those claims in that story stand up?
No, they don't. They read like mythology because that's exactly what they are. Just because you really, really like the stories, that doesn't make them true. For a video where Andy seems to think that he can prove Jesus, he really only proved his own stupidity. Here's what you need to do to prove these tall tales are true. You need direct, demonstrable, verifiable evidence that the specific events in question actually happened as described. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be easy to do. It's not. However, without it, it just becomes a matter of faith, and faith isn't a verifiable path to truth. The faith of the Christian is no more valid than the faith of the Hindu or the Shinto or the Baha'i. If I don't believe them, then I have no reason at all to believe you. You have to be able to back up your own stories, and sadly, they can't. None of them can. We knew that going in, of course, because they're really good at making claims, but piss poor at providing any kind of demonstrable support. But the support is what they need. Without it, they just remain laughingstocks. And that's all Andy Bannister will ever be. Sad, huh?
Boom, dicky, 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 boom, dicky,